Call the meeting to order. As you notice, I'm not Mayor Tolomer. I'm Diane Quan, City Council President. There's been a family emergency with the mayor, and he needs to be with his family this evening, so I am taking over in his place. Before we begin, even with the invocation tonight, let's just spend a moment thinking about Mayor Tolomer and his family and wishing them the tools that they need to get through the current situation. He'll be announcing it when he's comfortable to do that. And moving to the invocation. Father God, as we pause on this eve of our city election, let us remember those men and women who have bravely fought in our armed services so that we might have the freedom to choose our leaders. We thank you for all the men and women in uniform who protect and serve us each and every day here in our community. We are grateful for those who put the greater good and safety of their neighbors ahead of their own personal comfort and safety. Help us each in our own way to also give back to our community in gratitude for their sacrifice. Amen. Now for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, Council, you've received the minutes from the meeting on 10/21/19. Does anyone have any additions or corrections?
I move to accept the minutes as presented.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, minutes are approved. We'd like to thank all the visitors here this evening. Maybe our last nice evening that you can come to a city council meeting, and we appreciate you coming out and supporting this city. Oral and written communications. Lynn, do you have any comments on the MediaCom report?
No, I don't have any comments. It's down a little bit, about $100 from what it was at this period last year, so.
Okay. All right, Jeff Rao is with us this evening from Baker and Tilly. We've discussed before our comprehensive financial plan that was developed by a committee. Mr. Wilhite was our council representative. Our clerk treasurer was on that committee, our city planner, our mayor. Am I missing one?
Just Baker Tilly.
And Jeff. So he is going to go over that plan. If you remember, the purpose for the plan, it's a 5-year document to help us make budget decisions, to help us make decisions for any expenditures that we have moving forward, to be able to look at what our account balances are and where we may need to shore those up, or where we may have the option of moving some money around. And I told Mr. Rowe that I was going to let him explain it more fully in detail. So, thank you.
All right, well, thank you again, Jeff Rao with Baker Tilly. Appreciate your time this evening and opportunity just to take a few moments to kind of recap the results of the comprehensive financial plan. Mayor had asked that I kind of keep things high level. I know there's a lot that goes into these types of reports, and obviously to go through it all would take a lot of time. But I'm going to try to hit most of the high points, and then happy to address any questions that the council has this evening. But just as a brief introduction to kind of frame this report, this is, as you know, the first year that the city is kind of going through the overall comprehensive financial plan for the city. It was kind of prepared with the input and oversight of the Finance Committee, as was described. And really, the comprehensive financial plan was really born out of, not just with the city, but really other municipalities around the state, kind of born out of a need to look more, or be more proactive, looking ahead, taking a longer look forward in terms of the financial position of the city and towns, giving at the time, which was sort of the tax relief that was being provided through circuit breaker taxes, which resulted in less revenue of local government. So really these types of reports were sort of born out of that need. But really, it's aside from that, it's really a tool that's intended to be used by the decision makers, management of the city and the council, to be able to help make good, sound financial decisions, but also to bring financial accountability and also transparency to the citizens of the city. As you can imagine, one of the largest pieces of this type of plan is the capital piece. And the city, like many other municipalities around the state, have significant capital needs, infrastructure replacement needs, needs that are driven through economic development and other things. So this report incorporates all those capital improvement needs, again, that were identified by the city. And really what we're attempting to do is to take those future needs over the next 3 years or 5 years and really try to align those with potential sources of revenue, and again, at the same time, preserve financial accountability for the city. So as you can imagine, every year that goes by, things change. Capital needs change, operations change, and so the report is really intended to be a living document that really kind of coincides with the budget process that you go through. And so that's really the intent of the reports, or of the report. So with that, what I thought I would do is just kind of start out by just sharing briefly some of the historical trends and findings. And then I'll speak a little bit to kind of what we're seeing over the next few years. And then potential alternatives, funding alternatives that the city can consider. So with that, the historical trends and findings, and this is sort of at the beginning. I don't know if you're following along in the report, page 1-3 through 1-6 kind of shares some of the, again, at a high level, the historical trends and looks at different metrics. The first of which looks at, and this is on 1-3, looks at historical trends going from 2010 to 2019 in terms of net property tax, total net property tax that's collected by the city, and then the corresponding circuit breaker credits or property tax relief that is provided within each one of those years. And in 2013, and I'm just going to kind of focus on 2013 because that represented sort of the low point that occurred after the Great Recession. So the low point being the lowest amount of property tax revenue that was collected roughly 5 to 6 years ago. And at that time, the city collected about $9.4 million in net property tax, compared to what's expected to be received in 2019, which is just over $12.3 million. So about a 31% increase in tax revenue, $2.9 million over that period. So good positive trend there that we're seeing growth in terms of property tax dollars. And really that's not all related to a result of property tax increases, and we'll touch on that in a second, but really it's kind of overall growth within the assessed value of the city. At the same time, the circuit breaker credits or losses, again, going back to 2013, was around $500,000. That number grew to $780,000 in 2019. So roughly a 53% increase in tax relief that was given back to the property taxpayers within the city. So we've seen a greater increase, not in terms of dollars, but a greater percentage increase over that period of time in circuit breaker losses than we have in terms of net property tax revenue. The other historical metric we looked at, and this is just real brief, but just to sort of provide some context in terms of that circuit breaker credit or property tax relief is, how much of those circuit breaker losses is taken on by the city versus the other overlapping units within the county. And the city represents about 40% of those circuit breaker losses, so a pretty significant piece of those circuit breaker losses are borne by the city. The school represents the other majority, which is about 32% of circuit breaker losses. So in terms of, we just touched on property tax revenue and circuit breakers. The next metric on 1-4 sort of deals with net assessed value and what that trend has been. And then we're kind of overlaying that with the property tax rate that the city is implemented over the 9-year period. So again, I'm just going to kind of look at 2013. Again, that's sort of the low in terms of historically since the Great Recession. So at that time, 2013, we had $797 million in terms of assessed value, and that number increased to 918 in 2019. So about a 15% increase in net assessed value. So again, that's just a result of indication of growth within the city in terms of additional either commercial buildings, residential, what have you, that is being added over time, roughly a 15% increase. At that same time, back in 2013, the city's net tax rate was about $1 rounding, but $1.14 per $100 of assessed value, and in 2019, that number was about $1.28, so about a 12-cent increase over that period, or 10%. So again, the city's been able to manage the tax rate, both by way of assessed value, so growth in assessed value, and also in terms of controlled spending. But that tax rate has remained virtually the same, slightly higher over that 5 to 6 year period. The other sort of financial historical look that we looked at was cash balances, and we looked at really the major, selected major operating funds of the city, which included the general fund, motor vehicle highway, local road and street, park and recreation, cemetery, aviation, and fire territory. So of those, we looked at, okay, how much cash, actual cash, is each one of those funds held in total since 2011. And in 2011, those total cash balances were about $10.9 million, and that number rose to $13.2 million at the end of 2018. So again, the city has been able to not only preserve its cash balances, but grow those a little bit. Now, there was a little bit of a dip during that period, starting in 2013, again, which was kind of a low point. Those fund balances started declining a bit, which kind of the low point was in 2015 of $9.7 million, and that's when we started seeing, again, an upward trend to get to the $13 million. In terms of spending, again, within those selected operating funds, back in 2011 and 2013, annual expenditures were right around $14 to $15 million, and we have seen an increase in spending. 2014, 2015, dropped a little bit in 2016, and then back up in 2017, 2018. So we've seen about 26% increase in spending of the operating funds over that 5 to 6 year period, which is about a $4 million increase from 2013 to 2018. So again, I think just kind of speaks to the city's decision-making, the council's decision-making in terms of budgeting and controlling costs, that even though costs have gone up, sometimes that's out of control, out of the city's control. Even though that has gone up, the city has still been able to grow those cash balances over time and still maintained approximately the same tax rate over that period. So that's just to again, kind of touch on historically, and just sort of a recap, again, from an historical perspective. At the end of 2018, which is the end of our test period, the city had a strong cash position of just over $17.9 million in total for all city funds, with all the major tax-supported funds, that is. The general fund, which is the largest of those, made up about $6.4 million of those funds, so a good, strong cash position. And in terms of that $6.4 million balance, you may recall when the city recently went through the adoption of the investment cash reserve debt policies, that there was some thresholds established that wanted to maintain certain minimum reserves, and one of those reserves is within the general fund and some of the other funds, that you always want to, you never want to go below a 15% of your operating expenses. So as of the end of 2018, the general fund had 52% cash, 52% of annual operating expenses. So good, again, good, strong cash position. Going forward, forward-looking from 2019 through 2021, what we're seeing, again, based on budgets, expected spending levels, capital needs, we're seeing that we expect cash reserves to decrease by about $10 million over the next 3 years. That's attributable primarily to capital spending. So the city has identified about roughly $32 million in capital needs. About $12.8 million of those capital needs are expected to come from some sort of external funding, so grants and other places, which leaves about $19 to $20 million to be paid from funds on hand. So what we've done, again, is we've looked at offered up different alternatives to consider in terms of how do we take on that level of capital spending and still preserve good, strong cash balances and maintain minimum cash reserve thresholds. And we are looking at doing that, and have shown in the report that the city can maintain good, strong cash positions. One of which is by reallocating some levies between various funds. So within certain funds, some revenues are now coming in from the state, which means that the city could choose to no longer establish a levy or a tax rate for certain funds. And those levies and those funds then could be rolled into the levy, into the general fund levy. So that's just one area that we've looked at. We're also looking at leveraging that capital spending by utilizing some of the capital funds that the city collects, like CCD or EDIT, leveraging some of those funds to be used for capital spending, again, kind of moving them away from the general fund. So with that, and again, well, maybe what I'll do is just touch on the general fund real quick, because I think, that being the most significant of the funds, being the major fund that supports operating activity. Just want to touch on the projected. So again, at the end of 2018, the general fund had about just under $6.4 million. We would expect that balance to increase in 2019, and then decrease slightly in 2020, and then again in 2021. So when we look at the 3-year period since 2018, we're looking at a reduction in the general fund balance of about $1.7 million, but that still represents about a 33% operating balance number compared to operating expenses. So what we've seen and looking at historically is the general fund has had sort of a systemic, sort of struggling against a systemic issue where costs have outpaced revenues. Again, the majority of that because of circuit breaker losses. So some of the alternatives we're looking at, again, is to sort of try and relieve some of the pressure on the general fund, move that to other funds that could pick up that gap or that balance, and then also look at other funding needs. So, but I wanted to point out the sort of the status of the general fund and what we're trying to accomplish there. So with that, I just want to touch on just a few of the proposed action plan alternatives. I'm not going to necessarily go through all of them, but the first one, and I already kind of mentioned this, but it looks at shifting some of the levies from various funds to the general fund to help ease some of the burden on the general fund. Specifically, those funds are the fire pension, police pension, and the cemetery levy, which would free up or would move property tax dollars from those funds to the general fund to the tune of about $235,000 to $246,000 per year. So again, it's a pretty significant shift in those property tax revenues. Another alternative action plan would be to undertake a review of all city fees. So, and this is tends to be fairly common that over time fees are established, but they're not always revisited, and they kind of tend to always be there for a long period of time. Obviously, costs go up, and so it makes sense every now and again to kind of take a step back, review all those fees, if you will, just to ensure that they're adequate to cover the cost of providing that service. And again, looking at ways to try to ease the pressure on the property tax levy, maybe shift some of that to the city user fees.
That would be things like licenses and permits and.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
Parking tickets.
I sort of mentioned this before too, so I won't go into too much depth, but again, considering utilizing the funds that are legally available and sufficient for capital needs, looking at CUME cap development, CCD, EDIT, riverboat funds, looking at some of those various funds. And within this analysis, we are assuming a fairly heavy reliance on EDIT to cover some of the capital needs. Also, even though we haven't included this into the financial analysis, the city does have capacity to issue general obligation bonds, which, as you know, are bonds that are supported through property tax dollars. So the city has a certain limit in terms of how much the city can borrow through general obligation bonds. And as of the end of 2018, the city had about $2.9 million in bonding capacity, if you will. So again, kind of always looking at those other sources of revenues first. But if those become insufficient or are earmarked for other things, the city can still have the ability to issue about $2.9 million in general obligation bonds. Of course, we're always looking at opportunities to save money, and per the debt policy that the city adopted, we're always looking at opportunities to refund outstanding debt. We are looking right now at one of the outstanding sewage bonds, and so we're always looking at opportunities. Reverse back to earlier in the year, I would have said it's probably not an opportunity to refund because we started seeing interest rates in the bond market creep up. And that sort of took a turn midway through the year, where we saw interest rates in the bond market really start coming down. And so it really kind of opened up a window again to look at some refunding opportunities. So we're keeping a close eye on those.
Jeff, what would be the next bond we could refund?
Well, again, the one that we were looking at was a sewage bond. So the property tax supported, or the TIF bonds, those don't have call provisions that would allow us to, either because of the security of them or the call provisions would allow us to refund those at this point. However, and this is sort of an unusual circumstance with where rates are, what we're doing now, if there's a call date that is, say, 2 years down the road, so normally we wouldn't be able to call the bonds unless we were to do an advanced refunding. Well, now the federal regulations have changed, which did away with advanced refundings, so we can no longer do that. However, taxable interest rates have come down so far that it sort of brings those, even though we're not doing it as an advanced refunding, we may be able to refund some bonds on a taxable basis. Again, typically that's not doable, but in this unusual interest rate environment, it may be doable. So it's a long-winded way, I guess, of saying that we're looking at those. So even though they may not be currently callable, we're looking at those in terms of using a taxable rate, a taxable interest rate, and refunding them. Again, more to come on the refunding side. Alternative 9 is, if you're following on 1-8, consider establishing a city trash fee. This kind of goes back to the earlier point of looking at fees, and I can understand some resistance or concern about establishing new fees. However, a lot of municipalities, cities and towns have sort of been not required, but compelled, because of circuit breaker credits and other things, to shift trash from being funded through, say, their general fund to establishing a user fee. And that's just because it's become too burdensome on the general funds or other funds to be able to provide that service within its tax base. And so, again, just something to consider down the road. That would free up roughly $260,000 that is currently paid out of the general and parks and recreation funds that could be used for other means. The last thing I just want to touch on is operational review. And this is something that, again, more and more I think communities are looking at, and I think the city of Warsaw in particular might be well aligned with this type of analysis, in that the city is not the same as it was 5 years ago. Definitely is not the same as it was 10 years ago. So things have changed. Operationally, things have changed perhaps. Certainly costs have changed. And so, maybe city may be outgrowing itself in terms of how the city operates. So kind of when we see that type of scenario where the city's not just staying stagnant but growing and maybe experiencing some growing pains, I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of take a step back and look at how are we operating. Are we operating as efficiently as we could be? Are there different ways to consider maybe how we're operating? And that also kind of leads to efficiencies. So if we kind of look at various departments within the city and how those operations are being handled, or who's handling certain operations, there can be some efficiencies sometimes derived from taking a second look of how the city is operating. So I know that's one action plan that there's been some discussion about at the Finance Committee level. And again, I'm sure more to come on that topic. So with that, I am happy to, well, before I guess take questions, again, just kind of put a fine point on it. You know, the city continues to operate in a strong financial position. We've seen that historically, and we see that continuing over the next 3 years. Certainly it will take perhaps some changes in being creative in how certain costs, capital and other costs are paid for. But on the whole, we feel confident in terms of looking at the projected numbers that the city is in a good financial position going forward. So with that, happy to answer any questions.
Jack, do you have any comments, having sat on the committee?
I guess the only comment I've got is, you know, you ask yourself sometimes, well, why didn't we think about doing things like this sooner? You know, why didn't we think about coming up with a comprehensive financial plan that looked into the future like this does sooner? But, you know, things have to start sooner or later, and it's a good start. I think it's going to be a good tool for us going forward to see the pitfalls of some of the things that we're doing, and it's just better knowledge. Yeah, I think it's going to be a real help.
Yeah, I do too, Jack. You have to forgive me. You said you wanted to keep the conversation at an elevation.
Yeah, and I realized I really started getting down in the weeds. I
That's okay,
apologize.
but do you have any specific data on our rainy day fund from 13 to present?
We do.
Great.
So historically, and we went back to 2017, but within the rainy day fund, the city had about $1.8 million at the end of the year in 2017.
It's on page 2-31 if you have your report.
2-31, yes, thank you.
I was looking at the CCD fund, it wasn't making sense what you were saying.
Yeah, 2-31. Again, that number remained about the same in 2018. We were projecting about the same in 2019. Actually, we're projecting about the same all the way through 2021. So that's one of those funds that you know, you could certainly look at you know, tapping into some of those. We're always a little hesitant to recommend spending those dollars on capital needs, but really more to those dollars are reserved for rainy day, but more or less emergency situations. But certainly good strong cash position there, $1.8 million, and there are some
Thanks.
kind of, sure.
Now, if I recall, we build into this an annual review and possibly adjustment, is that correct? That the committee's going to look at it, and then hopefully we'll have it in time as we're making budget decisions to be able to use this document to help with those.
Right. In the policy that the city adopted, we actually included sort of specific dates so that in order to make that possible. So at the end of the year, beginning of the new year, we work with Lynn and her office on starting to gather all the financial data with the intent to have a report available. I want to say it's either at the end of May or June, right around that time frame, so that going into budget season, the council will have, and the finance committee will have a report to work from.
And then do I also recall that another purpose for doing this was to raise our ratings so that when we do go for a bond, we have a higher bond rating?
Yes, so the rating agencies have sort of a checklist of things that they ask about and look for whenever, you know, borrower is looking to issue bonds. comprehensive financial planning or long-term financial planning is one of those items. So it certainly goes to help strengthen the rating of the city's debt rating. It doesn't ensure necessarily an improvement in the rating, but at the very least, it at least demonstrates to the bond rating agencies that the city is forward-looking, and in their eyes, that's positive. So that helps the overall rating process.
Does anyone have any other questions? Okay, thank you, Mr. Rao, for making the
Okay.
trip up here. Oh. Could you come up to the microphone, please? Thank you, Roxanne.
Roxanne Kofelt. I have two questions, actually. How do you call a bond that's not callable? And if that's too complicated, you can email me.
No, that is a good question. So the way you do it is, or the way it's done is that, of course, in order to refund an existing bond, you have to issue a new bond. So the city would actually issue a new bond at a lower interest rate. And then the money that the city generates from that new bond would be set aside in an escrow account that would sit there and earn interest until the bonds are actually callable. So let's say the first call date is 2 years from now, but we wanted to refund the bond now to take advantage of the interest rate. So we would refund it now. And again, we would set that money aside into an escrow account that would sit there until the bonds are actually callable, and then the bonds, the existing bonds would be paid off from those.
It's not actually called early.
Right, right.
So my second question is, you're talking about calling these old bonds and issuing the new bonds, and I assume there's a cost associated with calling the old bonds, and there's a cost associated with issuing the new bonds. I'm assuming that the interest rate is that much lower that it covers those costs?
Correct. Yeah, so there's a couple different cost components. One is, and again, it depends on the specific call provisions of a bond, but oftentimes you'll see where if you call a bond early, there is a premium that's charged. Could be a 1% or 2% premium. At the same time, there's costs that are involved, professional fees and legal fees, bond counsel fees, underwriter fees associated with actually issuing the new bond. So when we go about looking at analyzing whether a bond is a good refunding candidate, we take all those costs into consideration into the overall analysis, so that the savings that is presented to the city are the savings net of all those costs. And so, yeah, all those things are taken into account.
Can I get a PDF copy of that?
Sure, I think I've sent electronic copies to the city, but yeah, be happy to work through the city and get a copy to you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
You know, since we're on finances, I did develop a question. Do we have an update on that sewer issue, that 160,000 yet? Do we have any further communications with the insurance company or anything? That's
He's
anybody.
asking about the billing error with Keystone, and whether there's any updates.
It's not resolved yet.
Okay, thank you.
All right, our agenda lists no unfinished business, so we'll move right into new business. And you had a conflict of interest from our stormwater coordinator, Ryan Workman. And I believe, looking at this, the period that he requested is January 1st, 2020 to December 31st, 2020. So, Mr. Royce, do you have your first conflict of interest? He's always on us to make sure we get these done. So, reading through Mr. Workman's conflict of interest, we need a motion to accept it or deny it.
Move to accept.
Second.
Aye, second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right. All right, that concludes our new business. Does anyone have any other matters that they'd like to bring before the council this evening, the council themselves?
Over the weekend, the committee to make a contract for the Common Council of the City of Warsaw sent out said contract for your review. And any discussion that may ensue from looking at it. I assume you all got it. I sent a text message as a follow-up just to make sure you didn't miss it.
Excuse me, Mike, what was this for?
It was for the contract for an agreement with the Common Council and an attorney.
Oh, okay.
I can get you, I don't think I CC'd you on that, Lynn, but I can certainly send you one.
I know I reviewed what you sent out, and I did not find any issues or have any issues with it. I was happy with what was written.
Yeah, it was a fairly basic contract. Ron and Diane and I spent hours really talking about how to do it, and I think we came up with a fairly good answer to that by using the existing contract that the city has with Rock Hill Pinnock and Mr. Royst, and we just reworded it, if you will, to make it our own. It's very simple, pretty direct. I think it will serve us well. Did anyone else, did everyone see it?
There's one substantial difference in what was before you and what has been discussed publicly before, and so our city attorney has recommended that we have a public discussion about that difference. And initially, the task force was looking at having a plan for accessing the attorney, or who could engage the attorney within the attorney contract itself. We do have a difference of opinion within our committee with whether or not that needs to be in the actual contract, or whether that should be in a rules of engagement that the council would adopt as to how you would go about hiring that attorney. But it was stated when we went to vote that the procedure that we were thinking about following was that at least 2 council members needed to agree to utilize the attorney, and that the city council president, whoever that may be, needed to be informed of that. That does not appear in this contract at all, and so it's something that we want to find out, what your feelings are about having that in the contract, or whether that would be a rules of procedure as to how to use the attorney. Again, it's very vague, but one of the legal issues with this is that the law says that the council can retain an attorney, but it doesn't say how that would happen
It
or
leaves it
who
open.
is the council. I mean, it doesn't say, can it be in the individual council member? Does it need to be the legal representative of the council, which would be the president and the one who actually signs the financial claims? And so that is a muddy water, and so we wanted to present that to the council just to see what your thinking were on that procedure, and whether or not you felt like it needed to be included in the contract itself. We took your directive to try to make it as simple as possible, and this is very bare bones, but it doesn't address that issue. And it's not addressed in the city attorney's contract, because it's assumed that the mayor is the one that would approve the expenditures for the city attorney. So here, there's not a point person, a case manager, whatever you want to call that, a gatekeeper of this contract and of these funds, the way it's presented, so.
Well, it was never mentioned either in the resolution that we passed.
Correct.
We had, I think we really tried to do due diligence and leave no stone unturned and look at every possible avenue, because we want to do this right. It's my understanding that we are the first Class 3 city in the state to be looking at doing this, even though apparently the option's been out there for a long time. And in our discussions, it came to mind that, we do have a city attorney. We don't want to circumvent our city attorney for city business. And if any of us, and I know we've all picked up the phone and called our city attorney, whether it was Mr. Valentine or Mr. Royst, and we did so freely. You just picked up our phone and called. We didn't have to have permission from anybody. We could call and get some advice. And I don't see any difference with a council attorney being available to any of us. We are all, I would consider us all citizens in good standing. We have been duly elected to represent the people, and sometimes we have questions that we need help with, we need advice with, that I don't want to talk to the city attorney. I want our own attorney that I can talk to. And the state gives us that right, and I think we should exercise it. I've talked a lot. Anybody else?
Well, I concur. If any restrictions are going to be placed on it, I don't think it should be in the contract. I think it should be in rules for the council. Personally, I don't think there's a council member here, or hopefully a council member in the future, that would actually cheat the council. If they did, it would certainly only happen once. So if we are going to place restrictions, I think it belongs in rules. I think council needs rules anyway, which we don't. And that might be a good place to start.
I don't have any problem with the restriction of 2 council members. I guess I would agree that maybe it doesn't need to be in the contract, but rather in the rules. And I know, speaking for myself, if I were thinking about contacting our own council, I probably would talk to the council president or another council member first. Am I all wet? Is this something, I know I probably wouldn't just do it on my own.
That's probably true. You might discuss, but that shouldn't be a requirement, to me. It should not be a requirement.
I feel, if I was gonna wanted to talk to the attorney, I would probably talk to 2 or 3 of you before I would ever call him to get your opinion on it. So I agree. I don't see any reason to put stipulation in the contract.
The other thing is, we're not paying this gentleman anything until we actually use him. There's no, in this contract, there's no retainer. It's strictly on an hourly basis. He's going to bill the city monthly, so whoever the president of the council is, will see the bills come in, and if there's a red flag, I'm sure that it can be dealt with in a timely basis. I don't see anybody running the table. I really don't. Like I said, we're all responsible adults, duly elected, given this statutory right to do this, and I'd like to try it, see how it works out for us. I think.
Something else to always remember is that our previous city attorney and our current city attorney both have told us that there are probably times when we need an attorney, and that's, in my mind, what this is, if there's ever conflict. But Mr. Valentine, when we were doing our golf cart investigation, actually told us that we might need one. And I know Mr. Royce has commented that there might be times when we could. because there'd be a conflict between the city and some of the ideas if we wanted to have legal counsel. So I think we keep that in mind as we go forward.
You know, you touched on something there, conflict. I'm not foreseeing a conflict, I'm not predicting a conflict, I don't want a conflict. All of you who know me know I'm not that person. However, we are two separate but equal branches of government, and I think sometimes even, you know, the tightest knit of families have issues, and you want to talk to somebody that you know and trust and want to get an unbiased opinion from, just for peace of mind, if nothing else. Or, you know, what should I do? I'm conflicted here, help me. It's not meant to be an adversarial
No.
situation at all, at all. I know some people might think that, but it's not the intent. You know, it's a year contract, 12 months, just like we have with Rock Hill Pinnock. So if it goes bad, it's not going to be bad for long. I don't anticipate that happening. But it's a start, and we have to start somewhere. It may not be perfect, but you've heard me sit up here and say before, I'm not willing to sacrifice something that I think is really good in this case for something that's perfect, because I don't know that we'll get there. But I think this is pretty darn close to it.
I guess my question is, where do we go from here? Do we have to vote on a contract? Does it just go to the Board of Works?
There's no requirement to vote on it. We just brought it before the council publicly because publicly we had discussed before what we thought might be in the contract, and working on it, it came out somewhat different than what we had stated, what we thought needed to be included in the contract. Again, like I said, we still have a difference. I personally think there should be a gatekeeper, so that the attorney knows that, yes, this is a legitimate request, and yes, I'm going to get paid for it if I work on it. So however we, come up with that, I think it needs to be there. He initially suggested it in his contract. Our city attorney suggested it in the contract that he helped us with, and that seems to make the most sense to me, that one person not just pick up the phone and call without doing some discussion with other council members.
Why not?
It just, because I think you can get off on a tangent in your own mind, and that it's good to sound out your ideas and think through clearly and make sure that you know
I
clearly
think that'll happen anyway.
what it is that you're asking. But we can't speculate on what may or may not happen. I feel that we're putting something together that, yes, it's going to be there for a year. And to me, a year's a long time with taxpayer money to not make sure that we're very fiscally responsible with how we're using it, but also just
So
that
you don't
we're-
think we would be fiscally responsible?
Excuse me, I'd rather not be interrupted until I finish. Thank you. But I just also think that it's important that we think through carefully engaging the services of a council attorney, and that we've made sure that we've used all the resources that we have available to us that the citizens have already paid for. And sometimes you just don't think about it. It just might not occur to you, oh, there's some other resource that I need to ask first before we take that step. And so that's what I'm thinking, is that sharing it with somebody else allows you to make sure that you're thinking clearly, and that we've said all along as a council that our intention is to exhaust all other possibilities before we would use the council attorney.
Can we make the commitment to have the task force come up with
Sure.
some rules of engagement prior to January 1?
I'd be open to do that. How do we get this to the Board of Works? What's our next step, if that's what we voted on?
Well, at any time you could submit it to the Board of Works. I think Mr. Lehman needs to sign it, that'd be correct.
He can sign it before or after the Board of Works approves it. We usually get 2 copies of a contract, and if it's not signed by both parties, we'll forward it on to the other party for their signature and a return.
As written.
Well, I'd like to move that we submit this agreement as written to the next Board of Works for their approval.
I'd second it.
You're not really in a position to take a vote because it's not on the agenda. You could ask for consensus, but,
That's, then I'll ask for
yeah,
consensus.
but it's not on the agenda
I
as a
didn't know if I had to
votable
make a
item,
motion.
so.
No, Sure.
We had a lady out there who wanted to speak. I just wanted to. Well, you can if you want. It's up to you. You're the.
Counsel, you do have someone that wants to make a comment from the audience. Do you want to hear it?
I think there's time after council's done at the end, isn't there, for community input?
Okay. Does anybody-
I haven't made any comments yet. I did go through the document this morning. I want to thank Mike for emailing it to me this weekend. I was asked, I think in the spring, early summer, if I wanted to meet with, I think it was the attorney that's in the contract. I didn't want to do it because I felt like I haven't seen anything like this. I'm wondering if the committee would be so kind enough to give me background information. You don't have to do it tonight, but I don't even, it's like just picking a name out of the phone book for me. I've never met the person. I don't know how many of you have interviewed with him, who else you interviewed. I would also ask, is it even in our best interest to have one attorney? 321, 3.2.1, I agree with Diane. When I read give legal advice to members of the Common Council of the City of Warsaw, I'm not clear on what that exactly means. I go into section 4, and conclusion of service, client may discharge attorney at any time. I'm a client, but I'm a part of this group. I again believe that this group should lay out very clearly what the protocol is. I might even go as far as say, you have to talk to our mayor's attorney, our city attorney first. You have to talk to the council president, maybe even before that. You have to talk to the state. You have to talk to maybe an attorney representing, Jeff was here tonight. We pay for this service. They have their attorneys. You talk to that attorney before you would get to this agreement. And then if, as Mike said, and again, I may not completely understand, Mike, what you're saying, and I hear, well, if we need to talk to somebody, we can do that. If one council member speaks to the attorney, do we all become informed
Yes.
on what the discussion was, almost verbatim? When would that be done? Would he, I don't even know where this gentleman lives. Would this be over the phone? Would it be, I want you to drive up here, I drive down to you? Again, I really think it's important. I just heard Diane, you say the committee was thinking 2 members would have to agree before we go to the attorney. Mike said, well, why can't I just do that? Again, right there, I think, is Jeff asking for protocol and guidelines to protect the group. 322 says this attorney can draft legal papers and documents. Now, I've served on this board for a few years. I can't imagine what that might be that our own city attorney or a contractor's attorney could not already do for us. Why would we have to go to this attorney? There were other things also that I looked at. I needed some clarification. Maybe Scott, have you had a chance to look at this agreement or
Is this the one that,
that might?
I want to make sure we're all I've seen several different versions of contracts regarding this
Okay.
over the last
Well-
few weeks. We're discussing the one I think that I received from Diane on Friday.
Okay.
I have looked at that. yes. It's the one, yeah, that's the one we're talking about. Yes, I have looked at. I believe it's all the same thing.
Okay. I have I don't want to take any more time, but countless things. I even think that there's some errors in the wording, attorney's activity, maintain a accounting or an accounting. I see in compensation 220 per